And this is what I want to talk to you about today. Sports potential to be a force for good, to be a force for a better world, as the theme of this forum actually says. And as you might have guessed by now, I am an active but also quite loud member of the sport and human rights movement. And I do believe, even though it might sound ironic, but I do believe that without the FIFA World Cup in Qatar, this movement might maybe not be where it is today. So what I'm trying in my research and in my consultancy work is to really help sports to be more responsible when it comes to human rights. To make sports even better for the people that are participating in it, as was already mentioned in the panel, fans, athletes, volunteers, coaches, officials, staff of sport bodies, hosting authorities, journalists, sponsors, and more. But also those people who are not directly participating, but impacted by it. For instance, the workers or local communities around an event. So what I want to talk to you about in the next 30 minutes, and hope to convince you of, is that university sports and the university sports movement is a perfect place to lead by example and become a responsible sport movement that respects and protects the human rights of all involved. I will try to do that by first talking about the what. What do I actually mean when I talk about sport and human rights? And also, what do I mean by responsible sport? Then about the why. Why is this important? Why it is important now? And also about the how. How university sports, in particular, can embrace the concept of responsible sport and lead by example. And I'm fully aware that it is me standing between you and a break, so I hope I will make this worth your while. Yes. You've heard me say human rights a lot now. And before I continue my story, I want to make sure that we are on the same page about what it means, or actually what I mean by it. And that brings me to my first point on defining human rights. It really is different. It can mean different things to different people, at different times, or in different places. And universities, including university sports, are a great place to experience, explore, and celebrate these differences through research, through international and cultural exchanges, lecture rooms, study groups, sporting events, and more. On a very general level, of course, human rights are those rights that all of us have or should have, simply because we are human beings, including rights to life, the right to education, the right to be free from torture. But when I explain human rights, I like to make the difference between human rights in theory and human rights in practice. Human rights in theory referring to sources of human rights, so standards written down in international United Nations documents, instruments, but also regional instruments and frameworks. Human rights in practice is, I think, more difficult to explain and grasp. It is quite contextual, and it's about how we as individuals or as groups experience our rights being guaranteed in everyday life, in our university life, in our sport life, and in situations where it matters the most, when we feel we've been treated unfairly or when we have experienced harm. So it is important to understand that which human rights are of most value to someone can be different depending on cultural, geographical, or socioeconomic or religious backgrounds. Whereas in some places of the world, the right to vote might be a natural given, in other places people have to fight for it. The same can be said about the right to education or the right to decent working conditions. But I think there's one thing that is true for many people around the world, perhaps everyone, and that is that human rights start in small places close to home. And I would like to quote here Eleanor Roosevelt, as you see on the slide, who is one of the authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She says, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet, they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. And unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning everywhere." I think this is a very, very powerful and timeless quote. And what this means is basically that human rights are about being able to learn and go to school, being able to buy or make food, being able to provide a home for your family, or express yourself and your opinions freely. And I strongly believe that if you look at these examples of small places that she mentions, it is perfectly possible to add sports and the local sports club to it. We know that sport can have an impact on a range of human rights, both positively and negatively. But we also know that there are a number of human rights that are particularly relevant in the sporting context, such as the right to freedom of expression, right to not be discriminated against, the right to equal pay for equal work, rights of migrant workers, as I talked about in my introduction. Let me try to make this a bit more concrete for the sporting context. So looking at sports and its challenges from a human rights perspective is, for instance, about how rules on who gets to participate in certain competitions, leading to the exclusions of others, is not just a matter of fair play and sporting rules, but actually a matter of access, diversity, inclusion, and the right to be treated equally and not be discriminated against. Or it is about the requirements linked to doping tests that athletes have to comply with, and this not just being a sport integrity issue, but actually a matter of right to privacy or right to health. Or it is about the treatment of local communities that are displaced for a sporting event, and how this is not a question only of creating a sustainable event, but actually a matter of housing rights with potential impacts even on their right to education or their right to work or livelihood. Or it is about treating a case of a volunteer that experienced harm at an event that he or she is volunteering at, not as an isolated case, but actually being prepared and having access to remedy in place, meaning mechanisms, processes, systems in place to address the harm and make good the harm. Let's now connect this with the notion of responsible sport. What you see here on the slide is a graphic developed by a colleague of mine at the Center for Sport and Human Rights, and it shows nicely how the idea of responsible sport connects with human rights in and through sports, and how both are the foundations of sustainable and more impactful sport, as well as related to topics such as sport integrity, safe sport, but also higher up, sport for development and peace, or sport and climate action, for instance. As such, the term responsible sport is not new, and it has been used in different ways and in different contexts. How we at the Center for Sport and Human Rights and in our community use this term is based on an understanding of responsible as being fully aligned with international human rights standards. This includes frameworks such as the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which have become, which might be surprising, a very influential document in the sport and human rights movement in the past years. The basic idea of these principles is that in order for businesses to maintain a social license to operate, they should conduct responsible business. And they have a responsibility to respect human rights throughout all their operations and activities. And it is this expectation that we are raising towards sports. Don't get me wrong, it is not about making sports responsible for all the human rights harms and issues in the world or in a given society. But it is about helping sports understand where it can have a positive impact on human rights in terms of respecting and promoting human rights, and that where it actually impacts negatively the human rights of people, that these impacts should be prevented and remedied. Looking at both sides is really key to make sure that sport keeps its status and meaning in society and its social license to operate. In many ways, raising this expectation towards sport is not too far-fetched, but actually based on what sport itself claims to be, and why I would like to talk about now, moving on to the next part of my talk. What you see on the slide here is a quote from Nelson Mandela from a speech he gave at the Men's World Cup Rugby Final in 1995. Some of you might know these words. The reason why I'm sharing it here because I think it summarizes very nicely the position that sport has in our society and the hopes and the expectations attached to that and that with such a position also comes a certain responsibility. So Mandela said, sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire, power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair. It is more powerful than governments in breaking down racial barriers. It laughs in the face of all types of discrimination. While this quote links sport's unique power to change to the issue of discrimination, it is true for the whole range of human rights generally. Again, important to understand that the link between sport and human rights has both positive and negative dimensions, right? Well, on the one hand, many of the issues that sport is struggling with can be examples of its negative human rights impacts. On the other hand, sport offers an amazing platform to promote human rights, not just to raise awareness, but to actually break down barriers and fight inequalities. It is often said that sport is a mirror of society, meaning that societal issues are reflected in sports. But let's not forget that this mirror does work both ways, and sport can lead by example and be a place for trying to solve issues and reflect the lessons learned in wider society. You might still ask, why should sport do that? And think of sport as being a place for athletic performance, competition, fun, fitness, and more, but not human rights. However, if you actually look at the values that sport promotes, and some of them were mentioned in the panel just before me, you will find that many of these values are very closely linked to human rights. In fact, in most statutes of sport federations, you will find references to fundamental values such as respect, equality, unity, non-discrimination. And these are, of course, underlying principles of human rights. And most statutes of international and also many national federations have an explicit provision on non-discrimination. The same is true for the FISU statutes I checked. And it is not just sports mission and values, it is also sports impact and legacy, which are linked to human rights in a way that sport is trying to create lasting benefits for a community. Similarly, sport integrity issues, and many of the relevant policies and regulations in that field deal with questions that need to be assessed from a human rights perspective in addition to the sporting perspective. And also the way sport develops and how it is used for development and development of peace has links to the respect for and the promotion and protection of human rights. What I want to say with all this is that there are many ways in which sport and human rights are aligned. Oh, wrong direction. There we go. If you're still not convinced, then I would like to draw your attention to some recent studies on athletes, which next to fans, volunteers, staff, officials, journalists, local communities, and more, are of course the key stakeholder group within sports. I know there are some athletes in the room, and I don't want to speak for you, but you might have even participated in these studies, or you can relate to the outcomes. The 3 studies I want to present today look at different but related things. On the left side, you can see the results of a study conducted by the World Players Association, which is, in case you don't know, the global body representing the voice of professional athletes. The study was published in 2021, and it relies on data received through an online questionnaire in which 300 athletes over the age of 18 from different countries in sports participated. The outcomes showed that 37% of athletes reported having experienced one form of physical abuse at least once as a child in sport. 61% of athletes have experienced one form of emotional abuse at least once as a child in sport. And 69% were not always aware that they had rights before they turned into adult athletes. And 51% of athletes were never aware of a union or a player association before the age of 18. In the middle, you see the results of a study conducted by researchers, Jetsa Tuakli-Buzorno and Shiri Becker, in case you know them, among others, published in 2022. These are results from a web-based survey among almost 1,200 athletes, most of them elite and competing from 70 different countries and across 49 different sports. The results show that 78.5% were unaware of any athletes' rights declarations, and that gender pretty much influenced participants' confidence in acting on their rights and in sports significantly. It also showed that player union membership increased confidence in freely expressing their opinion in the sports setting, and then generally athletes' rights-related awareness, knowledge, and beliefs were disconnected. Finally, on the right, you have another study by World Players Association, which relies on data received through interview surveys and focus group discussions with player development managers. And here it was about how player development managers see abuse being prevalent in their sports. And many of them said it is prevalent, and as you can see, a big part even said it's extremely prevalent. The problem is that also a large part of them said they feel their organization was either unprepared or only somewhat prepared to address this abuse. What these numbers and studies show is that we have plenty of evidence of human rights issues in sports. And I'm aware that this is a negative example, and there are tons of positive examples as well. But to stress the importance, I chose these studies and this topic. And what these studies also do is they hint at examples or at solutions, right? In this case, they show us that union membership can help to raise athletes' awareness on their rights. And like I said, other studies out there, for instance, talk about the positive impacts of mega sporting events on human rights. And really, we have seen a lot of increase in studies looking at the impact of sport and human rights. And the point I want to make here is that we have the data, it is telling us a lot, but we have to get better at using that research and knowledge for working towards change and a better world of sport. How to achieve that? Let me come to that, continue with that now. So I would like to finish my talk by applying this thinking to university sports and reflecting a bit more on the role that university sports can play in creating a better sporting world. And we already heard a lot of inspiring words from the panelists about how to do that, and I want to try to add to that. But before I turn to my own words and my own thoughts on this, I want to briefly share some results of a very small study that I conducted myself among colleagues in preparation for coming here today and talking here today. So I asked my colleagues the question, what role can university sports play in advancing sport and human rights? And I did receive a very long list of things, which I'm happy to share with anyone that's interested, but here I just want to focus on the highlights for now. So the first one, as you can see on the slide, says modeling the culture of responsible sports governance we'd want to see in the world outside. Another one, sports students and local grassroots human rights groups, student human rights groups, to set up joint promotional activities, share learning, peer learning, do projects together. From another colleague, young athletes to become human rights champions in the community with support of their peers. And finally, a very practical and direct one, FISU, to develop a human rights policy, for instance, for its World University Games. Like I said, the list is much longer, but I want to share with you now what I identified as common themes and threats from all of the answers that I received. The first one, innovation. Innovation on responsible sport practices through research and experimentation, and being a model for a world of sport that fully respects human rights. The second one, sharing knowledge and findings of such research and experiments with the rest of the world of sports. The third one, engagement. Engaging student athletes, coaches, and others in sports to raise their awareness, but also, and this is very important, include their perspectives. And finally, education. Education through integration of sport and human rights into relevant study programs, sports law, sports management, but also human rights programs, but also into workshops, debates, case studies, field trips, and more. These key terms, innovation, sharing knowledge, engagement, and also education, are of course the foundations of universities around the world. And I couldn't agree more with what my colleagues came up with. So for me, there is no better place to advance the sport and human rights movement than in university sports. I personally have been on a bit of a mission these past years, as I believe that really one of the key ways to bring this movement forward and to make it sustainable is through education. And I've led many initiatives to develop programs, courses, master classes, resources on sport and human rights. And it's very exciting to see that this field is growing and there's now much more on offer than a couple of years ago. I would like to end my talk by coming back to what I shared with you in the beginning, how 5 years ago, not a lot of people understood my area of work and looked a bit lost when I said I work in sport and human rights. And to be honest, I myself did not expect this to become such a topic, but luckily for me and others, this did change significantly. And that is the result of hard work of many actors within the sport ecosystem, including our own work at the Center for Sport and Human Rights, but also the Buster Institute. And examples of this work include, for instance, like I said, developing research and educational formats on sport and human rights, such as a handbook on mega sporting events and human rights, but also a global sport and human rights academy, which holds online courses, but also in-person learning and summer courses on the topic. Or the launch of an entire global sport and human rights research network, which is growing steadily, but also very practical work. So in the past couple of years, we've helped a number of sport bodies to understand their human rights responsibilities better and to embed that into their work, into their organizations, as we've helped them to develop human rights policies, not just for them as an organization, but also for their events or human rights action plans. And the best thing is that we do see changes where it really matters the most, changes on the ground within sports organizations and sporting events. You might know that the Paris Olympics and Paralympics are the first games to be organized with human rights forming an important part of the host city contract. And they even had a human rights policy in place. The same is true for the Men's European Football Championship that took place in Germany this year. The Qatar World Cup was the first World Cup with 100 human rights volunteers working on the ground, observing, conducting interviews, collecting data. And this past December, the German Olympic Sports Confederation has adopted a human rights policy, as to my knowledge, the first national Olympic committee in the world to do so. There's much more to add to this list, and I do think the fact that I'm here today talking to you about sport and human rights is also proof of that. But it also shows that the university sports movement is seriously considering their role and contribution to creating a better world, a world of sport in which respect for human rights builds the foundation for inclusive, accessible, equal, sustainable, impactful, and collaborative university sports. Thank you for your attention. And I was told we have some time for question and answer in case someone has a comment or a question. And if you're all very hot like I am, then we can also move that to the lunch break. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise in human rights and sport. It was so important because our main theme of this FISU World Forum is actually university sport, creating a better world. This morning we've heard about the role of sport as, let's say, powerful diplomatic tool to create a better world, but now you shared with us how important it is, this component of human rights in sport, including university sport. Thank you so much for that. Definitely we cannot create a better world without respecting human rights. I hope there are questions to our keynote speaker. Please, if you want to ask, this is the moment. Is there anyone who would like to know more? Yes, the lady here. Just wait for the micro. It is coming.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. I just wanted to ask, other than implementing laws, what are other substantial ways to actually see the human rights movement being involved in sports?
Sure, there are plenty of ways. I think this implementation through laws is something that is in and of itself not the most, well, it is important, it is a starting point, right? But what we try to do when we work with sport bodies or with event organizers, we try to really help them understand that just having a policy and just implementing laws is really not enough. You need to have a policy with an action plan attached to that. And as part of the action plan, you can imagine things like education, for instance, having educational awareness-raising initiatives among staff to, of course, make sure that there's also an organizational culture that reflects this idea, but also to the outside world, right? And I think very practical things as well is to really bring together different stakeholders that have a stake in, this connection of sport and human rights. Organizations that, for instance, work with athletes that feel discriminated, to try to help understand their perspective and bring them to the table together, organize roundtables, for instance. But also very practical things like when we look at the events that I just mentioned that now have a human rights policy in place, another thing they did is they have a grievance mechanism in place. So having an online mechanism or a hotline where when something can go wrong, people can actually raise a concern, and then also making sure that the way it's operated is reflects expertise among the range of human rights issues that could come up in an event, for instance. I hope that helps a bit to make it more practical. Great.
And thank you very much. It's so useful because we have here so many representatives of the National University Sports Federation, so each of them might be interested to know how to implement human rights policy in their federations. Are there any other questions? Gentleman over there. The micro. Over there.
She already has a microphone.
Okay, super.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. I'm not a gentleman, I'm a lady.
Sorry.
Sorry.
It's dark, so I cannot see actually well.
It's the cap. My question is directed to maybe FISU officials to find out whether we have something about human rights in place for the world universities, and which is cascaded down to other continental bodies and the National University Sports Federation to address this important issue on human rights. Do you have something? Or FISU officials maybe could help us know whether there's something like that put in place. My name is Florence Gitao from Kenya.
I'm not a FISU official, but I can, from what I've seen and researched, is that there's no official document. But I've seen, and this is really why I wanted to make these points today. I think that if you compare what I've now learned, and I'm new to this, what I've learned about FISU and the university sports movement, if you compare that with the other regular sports movement that I so far worked in, there's so much happening in terms of human rights in practice. I think there's a good awareness of diversity and the issues around that and how to strengthen that. There's a good awareness about environmental concerns as well. And I think a human rights policy can really help to build a foundation to that and make sure that all these initiatives, they stay, they're sustainable, and they become stronger. But again, I'm not a FISU official. I don't know if anybody wants to answer that. I think yeah.
I may just say that this afternoon we will have a session What's Up FISU with our president, so that might be also an occasion to respond, unless he wants to do that now.
Well, I think I can immediately answer that. Can you hear me? Okay. We don't have a document like that, as I mentioned before, but in many fields of our actions, now it's better. We don't have a document, a written document for human rights, but in many fields of action, as you mentioned, also coming from the global strategy. In practice, we try to work in this direction, but it's certainly a very important input, and having the chair of the development committee and the chair of the education committee, I think this is one of the inputs we can take from your presentation and from the forum for the future work. So no written document, but in the practice we really try also with the continentals to implement some practice from human rights. That's correct. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can take one more question.
I think she has a microphone up. Yeah.
I just had a question, more so for the student athletes and like athletes in university now. I know that you talked about laws and events and all these things. These are big, awesome things happening. But for us as athletes, what are things we can do for the sport federation as a whole, even more so on like the groundwork where we're at? I know we learned earlier that we can be like ambassadors for change. So what can we do to implement all these things that you're talking about? Because we're not on these like law boards or whatever. So just curious on your perspective for us.
Yeah. I will try to answer that, but again, I want to be very humble here because I've never been a student athlete. I've never been in your shoes. But what I think helps is to organize amongst yourselves, to find an organized voice. Of course, allow for different perspectives, right? This is also what human rights is about. And I, again, think that this being university sports, this is something that you anyways do at universities, right? So there are structures already in place that can help you. And then when you have an organization, a format that works for you, ask questions, ask the right questions, just like now, questions that can perhaps trigger change and make demands on, for instance, topics you want to learn more about, you want to be discussed. So yeah, I think that's one thing that hopefully helps.
Let's allow one more question over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Lovisa and I'm a part of the Swedish NUSF. And I know in our country, when the research talks as well a lot about these gray zones, the gray areas, and sort of what is happening when we're talking about human rights and which issues are clear, but we see large issues in actually defining what are we talking about here. So can you elaborate a little bit more about sort of defining these areas and talking about the gray areas, which we cannot, we don't know a lot about them.
Yeah, I can try, although I think this is a lecture in and of itself, because of course there are many gray areas. I think there are gray areas within human rights in and of itself, and then there are gray areas applying that to sports. And I think one thing that is, when we are now trying to bring this conversation to sports bodies, they are often scared and say, we are not going to fix the world, why? That's not our task. And that's fully correct. This is not what we're trying to do. So for us, it's really about understanding where does sport have impacts on human rights, both positively and negatively, and scoping it that way. But even within that, so if you then have an identified, map of what are potential issues here, both things to promote and both things to address, of course, human rights can clash. So there are a number of human rights which are not absolute. And that's also why we have courts. Why we have courts that need to interpret laws and that need to interpret them in specific situations. And why there are certain judgments going in one way and judgments going in other directions. So I think these are the gray areas where more understanding is needed. But also, I think, going back to what I said before, what matters for one athlete and their right doesn't need to be the same for another athlete. So also understanding that, right, that there are different perspectives, different interpretations of human rights. And again, I think this is the beauty of universities, that you can celebrate these differences and really bring them together and create understanding for each other.
Thank you very much. No more questions? If not, let's thank once again to our keynote speaker.